Good evening, lovely audience, and welcome to the first in our lecture series, Myth, Religion and Race, that accompanies the exhibition Harmonia Rosales Entwined, which can be seen until the 1st of May at UCSB's Art, Design and Architecture Museum. I'm Helen Morales, and I'm the Argyropoulos Professor of Hellenic Studies in the Classics Department at UCSB and curator of the exhibition, with Dr. Sophia Quach-McCabe and with the assistance of Classics graduate student Lexi Trikoulis. The exhibition, which presents stunning new work by Harmonia Rosales, celebrates the Orishas, West African Yoruba deities, and their fabulous tales of love and lust, envy and betrayal, death and renewal. The Afro-Cuban tales are entwined, sometimes explicitly, more often through subtle allusions or omissions, with tales from Greek mythology. Harmonia Rosales herself spoke about the exhibition a couple of weeks ago, and on February the 24th, we have Professor Elizabeth Perez from UCSB speaking on decolonizing the Orishas, Harmonia Rosales, and the unwhitewashing of Black Atlantic divinities. And on March the 3rd, Professor Vilna Bashi from Northwestern University speaking on cultural appropriation, syncretism, and authenticity. All of these details are on the Art, Design and Architecture Museum website, so if you missed anything, please go to the museum website. The exhibition and programming are made possible through the support of the Argyropoulos Endowment for Hellenic Studies, and the departments of Classics, Religious Studies, Black Studies, Chicana and Chicano Studies, History of Art and Architecture, the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, the CAP Center, the Center for Black Studies Research, the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, the Division of the Humanities and Fine Arts, and the Society for Classical Studies, Ancient Worlds, Modern Communities Initiative. My and Sophia's gratitude goes to Professor Gabriel Ritter, the new director of the museum, and Professor Sylvia Pereira, who served as interim director before his appointment, as well as everyone in the museum who worked on the exhibition, and the Classics finance officer, Severo de la Cruz, and of course to Harmonia Rosales herself. Someone once said to me that very often artists are not so nice when you meet them in person, but we couldn't have wished for a more generous and warm-hearted collaborator than Harmonia. Visionary, generous, warm-hearted, change maker. All of this also describes our speaker today, Professor Dan-el Padilla Peralta from Princeton University. Dan-el is a classicist specializing in the history of the Roman Republic and early empire. His book, Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, is published by Princeton University Press. He also researches contemporary American and Latin American cultures and has a chapter on classical reception in Santo Domingo in the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Political Theory. And if you haven't already, you should read his extraordinary memoir, Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League. Dan-el has become something of a lightning rod for discussions about race and social justice in classics, sometimes at great personal cost, but always changing academia and society for the better. We owe him much gratitude. And today, his talk is on The Greeks Are Then, the Orishas Are Now, Harmonia Rosales and the Black Atlantic. Professor Dan-el Padilla Peralta.
Thank you so much, Helen. I am floored by the introduction, not least because it is difficult sometimes to see myself as a change maker or a visionary, but also because I stand forever in the debt of the many folks who have enabled my feats of vision. And I hope that the talk gives a sketch, however impressionistic and provisional, of the many contours of my indebtedness. I'll also reincorporate your expressions of gratitude into my expressions of gratitude. There are so many people to thank for making this event possible, but I want to single out above all for this expression of gratitude, Harmonia Rosales, because it is her work that has expanded my horizons of sight and that has made it possible for me to appear before you in the capacity of interpreter and interlocutor. So with that, I will share some slides. My objective for tonight's talk is to advance some frameworks for interpreting and contextualizing the works on exhibition. I start by stressing that as a settler of color on Lenape lands, I appear before you today and address you as an audience that resides on the lands of the coastal Chumash people. Embracing the call of Teresa Stewart Ambo and Kay Wayne Yang to move beyond land acknowledgement, I hope that this talk will further the project of, in their words, quote, enacting epistemologies beyond the settler present, beyond colonial sovereignty, and beyond the human, end quote. But more than anything, and as a necessary precondition for this enactment, I hope that my words in our conversation enter into and maintain a proper and faithful relationship to these lands and their traditional custodians. This talk couldn't exist independently of Harmonia Rosales' universe, but its conception is also indebted, in ways small and large, to one of 2021's most electrifying memoirs, Kiara Alegria, Who This Is My Broken Language. Who This is so gifted at memorializing her personal growth into the practice of art, and crucially, her transformation into the kind of writer who could weave out of the many strands of her Philadelphia Boricua existence dramas for the stage. In the memoir's 33rd chapter, she taps some of the pride and excitement that surged in her earliest moments of playwriting as memories bidden and unbidden from her childhood spilled out on the page. Mom's spirit world filled every page. My work dripped with Los Santos. Yemaya entered stage left. Lights rose on Oshun. Ochusi, the herbalist, lurked behind the garden scene. Sometimes the Orisha were main characters front and center. Other times they went unnamed, my secret code behind the story. One play had mostly conventional scenes that I interrupted midway for intentionally awkward rituals, sensual, silent moments. In these rituals, an actor moved her body in embarrassing ways when words became insufficient. A ritual to mourn a wife lost to fire, a ritual for a boy's first sexual arousal, invented ceremonies, the stuff of dreams. But all Mom's cleanings and eros and possessions lurked between the lines, gave me a physical vocabulary to put on stage. Magic realism, the dramaturg said. The label irked me. You're Greek and Roman gods, my classmate said. You're Romulus and Remus, you're Echo and Narcissus. The comparison annoyed me. Sensual is different than magical, I thought. The Greeks were then, I thought. The Orisha are now. I've been unable to separate myself from this passage in the months since reading the memoir, and it's furnished me with a vantage point from which to contemplate the impact of Rosales' work. Comparison of the sort that came immediately, one might even say reflexively, to Who This Is classmates, is a seemingly ubiquitous feature of responses to the work of Afro-diasporic artists who play with those iconographic signifiers that are ascribed or sourced to Greco-Roman classicism. Notice how Who This responds to the comparisons. She dispatches the association with magic realism by stressing the gap between magical and sexual, by not allowing the latter to be overwritten into or subsumed by the former. But next comes the decisive maneuver around the attempt to claim her world, her creative world, as simply another expression of Greco-Roman classicism. The Greeks were then, the Orisha are now. I vibe to this clear-voiced affirmation of temporal distance and priority, even as I strain to grasp its enigmatic many-sidedness. The statement has perhaps a relativizing aspect to it. From Who This Is position, the Orisha are alive and pulsing. They are hers now, whereas the Greek and Roman gods exist as possessions of the past. But would it follow, and would who this be also happy or reluctant to concede, that the classmates for whom this comparison renders her work legible inhabit a space-time in which the Greeks exist now, but only for them? Or is her remark intended to deny any claim to presentness that the Greeks may have for her classmates in the first instance, but presumably for other readers and interlocutors of her work with similar social formations? As one site for the exploration and sharpening of these and other questions, let me offer up Black classicism. This is a subfield of classical reception studies whose main focus, Emily Greenwood, my colleague, defined in 2009 as follows, quote, an examination of the work to which the classical tradition has been put in Africa and the African diaspora, ranging from the hegemonic appropriation of classics by colonizers and slave owners to the use of classics as an ironic counter-discourse that writes back to racism and imperialism, or as a source of mythopoesis in the formation of modern Black identity, end quote. There is no debate, at least as far as I'm concerned, about the mythopoetic generativity of Harmonia Rosales' scripts, of paintings. In this respect, it's quite right to situate and contextualize them as expressions of Black classicism. But it may be worthwhile to examine Rosales' place within modern and contemporary interventions in Black classicism from several different angles. Of particular interest to me is the premise of writing back to imperial centers and their racializing assignments, an idea tested by Helen Tiffin and others. As Philip Zapkin has argued in an article that appeared just this month, Tiffin's theory of canonical counter-discourse, crystallized in the 1980s, holds ample power and relevance for reading contemporary Caribbean poets, Sharon McCollum, Dorothea Smart, among others. There's friction in applying the logic of the right back to visual expressions of Black classicism, however. How and why classical reception studies persist in encoding and or validating moves against historically white-centering modes of classicism as fundamentally literary in nature is a question that I hope we can take up in the Q&A. For now, though, my focus is going to be on the general properties of Black and specifically Black Atlantic classicism as these bear on the felicitous interpretation of Rosales' work. Greenwood and I were both contributors to a volume entitled Classicisms in the Black Atlantic, co-edited by Ian Moyer, Adam Lechner, and Heidi Morse, that appeared in 2020. As the volume's title signals, the project around which the various contributions coalesced was the critical reception and mediation of Paul Gilroy's notion of the Black Atlantic. In revisioning the Atlantic as the space within which multiple and often conflicting classicisms were formulated and distributed, the editors were alert to several challenges, some of which were more amenable to negotiation than others. And I'll quote, the exploration of classicisms in the Black Atlantic as a transnational chronotype, founded on the violence of the Middle Passage and sustained by the crossings and circulations of people, artifacts, texts, and ideas, affords several possibilities for classical remediations, as Emily Greenwood points out. On a basic level, the classical past and its discourses have served as one element, one medium in a very discursive and artistic repertoire through which Black Atlantic intellectuals and artists have been able to represent to a wide world their particular modern experiences and conditions. And yet there are obvious tensions in this proposition. On the one hand, there is the often held assumption that the availability of classicism for reconstructing Black pasts, presents, and futures is grounded in its universal humanism. On the other hand, there's the historical fact that the classical legacies of ancient Greece and Rome have been appropriated by modern European cultures as dominant as they are hegemonic and have been used to buttress civilizational and racial hierarchies, thus making those classical legacies complicit in justifying racial violence. This tension supplies the basic conditions for several different critiques and remediations of classics and classicism. We emphasize a plurality of classicisms in this book's title. It represents an acknowledgement that the reconstruction of classicisms entailed in recuperating and representing experiences in the Black Atlantic will be capacious and involve the past of Egypt, Ethiopia, West Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the ancient world, end quote. One concern to lodge here is what happens when classicism of the historically white-centering and white supremacist form occludes the recuperation of Black Atlantic experiences, or even more problematically, remains implicated in their continuing effacement. It's fine to lift up a plurality of classicisms, but in a deliberately cantankerous and perhaps unjustifiably zero-summing mode, I'll voice the belief that this plurality cannot and should not be uninterrogatedly ecumenical. Dominant hegemonic modes of white-centric classicism have got to go. Otherwise, they will continue to threaten the cultivation and elevation of other classicisms, mainly because they will hog cognitive and material resources that are sorely in need of redistribution. We saw a relatively mild version of this process at work in the response of Hulis's classmates to her plays. There are, of course, more corrosive versions. The systematic denial of capital and infrastructure for the expression of Black classicism, unless it conforms to fairly straitjacketing ideas of what constitutes the classical, is one of the more conspicuous. To sharpen this line of analysis some more, let me turn briefly to the museum space and to museum spaces more generally, as one scene for the enactment of this historic resource appropriative crime. Some years ago, a visit to the University of Kansas coincided with an exhibition of the Haitian American artist Ulrich Jean-Pierre at the Spencer Museum of Art. The Ties That Bind, Haiti, the United States, and the Art of Ulrich Jean-Pierre in Comparative Perspective, an exhibition that was curated by Cassandra Messick-Braun. My favorite of Jean-Pierre's paintings is a rendering of the Bois-Caïman gathering of 1791, at which enslaved Africans from multiple plantations convened secretly to lay the groundwork for what became the Haitian Revolution. The meeting was capped by the sacrifice of a Black pig to the Loi Exili Dantor. Here is Michel Rolf Trouillot's description of the event in Stirring the Pot of Haitian History, newly republished in an excellent translation from Creole. When Saint-Domingue slaves were scheming their attack, they needed an organization. They drew on the only kind of organizations they knew of, voodoo organizations. People badmouth Wakaïman in two ways. They say it was just a political gathering. They say it was just a mystical ceremony. Whether they take it seriously or whether they take it for mumbo jumbo, they don't take it for what it was. Four things happened at Wakaïman. A Mambo voodoo priestess killed a pig. The rebels drank the pig's blood. The rebels swore they wouldn't betray the cause. They decided how they would attack. People who studied the religion of the Homean spirits encounter a similar ceremony in Africa. Killing pigs, drinking pig's blood, oath taking. That ceremony has three meanings: solidarity, trust, and secrecy. That ceremony means all initiates stand strong together, all initiates believe in one another, and all initiates would rather die than speak the secret. Therefore, it wasn't a political gathering, which would mean wasting time, speaking French, and competing against one another. What happened was political, but it wasn't only political. In any case, it wasn't the same type of politics known to most European people. But the slaves weren't messing around either, and they weren't cracking jokes. It was a voodoo ceremony that was simultaneously the most important political oath they could mutually take before they decided to turn Saint-Domingue upside down. I quoted Trouillot's account at length for two reasons. The first is that while it would have been easy enough to skip over the details of this event with a nod to an Anglo-American facing publication on the Haitian Revolution, listening to the words of a Haitian historian and anthropologist is an exercise in beginning to dethrone and cast out those interpretations of Wakaïman that simply exoticize what occurred, or that configure its meanings by reference to another historical constellation of circumstance and action that is presumed to carry greater exemplary or explanatory weight. This exercise in directing attention also serves to break, or at a minimum force the reconsideration of certain moves to comparison. On account of my own disciplinary training, the temptation is strong to line up the pig oath of Wakaïman with pig sacrifices in Roman culture, for example. But what is accomplished through such comparison, and how might that move, were I to undertake it, overwrite the culturally specific logics of Wakaïman's narrativization in Trouillot and or Ulrich Jean-Pierre's visual representation? The second reason for quoting at length is that both the original publication in Creole of Stirring the Pot of Haitian History and its translation into English were intended as reparative moves. In a landscape of knowledge production about the Caribbean that to this day remains dominated by predominantly white academics whose training in predominantly white North American and European institutions is structured around North Atlantic intellectual practices, the need to center Creole language and literature as intellectual resources in their own right could not be more acute or pressing. And yet, paradoxically, the only way of making that case and of lifting up Creole study as deserving of more resources is by entering cautiously into the realms of the Anglophone. This last point brings me back to Jean-Pierre's painting and to the exhibition at the Spencer Museum. To see his painting in a museum in the American heartland that, as the curatorial frame for the exhibition explained, was linked to Haiti because of vectors of commerce and enslavement before and after the Louisiana Purchase, elicited all kinds of feelings in me as a native of Hispaniola. What Caïman also matters to me as a historian of slavery who strives to pay particularly close attention to the religious subjectivities of the enslaved and the extent to which these subjectivities inform collective and collaborative action. But the exhibition as a whole, and this painting in particular, were not exactly conducive to a congratulatory or even so much as an affirmative disposition. For one, I found it unsettling that even in the company of my undeniably well-meaning hosts on the visit to the Spencer Museum, references to the exhibition were laced with what I could only call the look at us, we're inclusive ethic of relationality. Some of the interactions in and around the Spencer Museum exhibition summon to memory the opening paragraph of Yoon Song Kim and Maya Isabella McBandilal's coruscating essay, The Whitney Biennial for Angry Women. This is the entry on white spatiality. There is a specter here that haunts this space. It has multiple faces. We'll call one white supremacy, the belief in the universal, a pure idea arrived at by a series of white men who have combed through culture and curated its worth. Another face we'll call visual oppression. We'll call it passing. We'll call it presence without provocation. We'll call it just enough black faces to assuage liberal guilt without the discomfort of challenging anything. We'll call it the fantasy of post-racial America. We'll call it visible invisibility, end quote. As the remainder of their essay goes on to examine, white spatiality is one of the devices for locking into place and space the, quote, titillation of brush with the radical, a safari of political rebellion, without the nuisance of actually addressing systems of power or challenging their status, end quote. To meaningfully mount such a challenge would require a robust program of decolonization that goes well beyond the term's metaphorical usage, a usage expertly and witheringly critiqued in Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang's 2012 essay, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. If it is not substantively and radically committed to redistribution and repatriation, rematriation, it is not decolonization. It's these intermediations that I bring to the encounter with Rosales' exhibition at your museum. To the extent that this exhibition finds a home in Black classicism, the analytic work before us is first to theorize how such a classicism might insist on terms for its own interpretation that do not subordinate it to a presumptively higher or more exemplary or more authoritative classicism. And second, to realize such an interpretation, not only in the craft of knowledge production that takes Rosales' paintings as their chief subject, but in the ordering of those systems within which such knowledge production is necessarily and unavoidably founded. With the phrase, the ordering of those systems, I'm gesturing directly to the notion of the museum as a warehouse of cultural value, a warehouse located within what Madhura Umachandran, in a splendidly searing critique of Jeff Koons, is characterized as that, quote, logic of the commodity reproduction, end quote, in which art, quote, armors itself against theory, end quote. One component feature of that logic, as Umachandran flags with reference to Koons, is the banalization of antiquity. But that's not of concern with Rosales' body of work, which dynamically animates multiple registers of antiquity in ways far more varied and capacious than Koons' works do. But the logic of commodity reproduction is at stake in the assignment of value to her pieces by dint of their exhibition within the spaces of this museum, or any Euro-American settler colonialist museum for that matter. The findings of a 2019 investigation into the holdings of 18 major US museums can help orient and ground this part of my argument. Through painstaking research into museum catalogs and some nimble statistical modeling, the 9-person team responsible for this study was able to determine that across the museums as a whole, 85% of artists were white and 87% of them were men. Now, one way to respond to these results is to agitate for deepening and widening the diversity of museum art holdings, as the authors of that report and its most sympathetically inclined readers have already done. I support that mission. But the trap that the logic of commodity reproduction ultimately springs is also activated by the curation of select Afro-diasporic artists against the backdrop of the persistently white museum and of the museum as a settler colonial institution. Even as the work of these artists appreciates in value and critical regard their individually most provocative aspects, in the case of Harmonia Rosales' paintings, the invitation to imagine otherwise by bitchifying, risks being subordinated to capitalist precepts of accumulation and extraction, the bedrock of what Nancy Leon has lately inappropriately dubbed identity capitalism. How to escape this trap, and in time how to neutralize it such that it never springs into action again, is the big question. Attention to the finer entanglements of Rosales' work can energize our pursuit of some answers to it. Seeing as the exhibition's title is entwined and its description stresses Rosales' quote, interweaving of representations of ancient Greek and Yoruba mythologies, unquote, I want to give a quick shout out to Vanessa Stovall, whose essay on dressing down myth for the public books antiquities section, edited by Stephanie Wong and Sarah Bond, came out today. Stovall, who in my view is a wizard theorist of the fabric and fabrication of myth, takes up in this essay the question, quote, how does one undress oneself from the myths with which one has been clothed, end quote. There's ethical urgency to this question, not least because, as Stovall explains, quote, female figures in Greek and Roman myth are often stripped, tripped, and ripped out of the archives themselves. Furthermore, it is often the stripping, tripping, and ripping of women in marginalized groups in myth that gets reproduced across media, ancient and contemporary, end quote. The answer that Stovall proposes is myths tripping, the trinity of fragmentation, fabrication, and fabulation that is decomposable into constituent crafts and composer muses. Time doesn't allow us to take Stovall's method for a test drive through Rosales' paintings, but what I want simply to note for now is that in the complex of weave work and fabric, we may, and I emphasize may, be entering a space in which capitalist imperatives of valuation are slowly emptied of their destructively mesmerizing power. I say may because on the one hand, it does not take a Silvia Federici reading Marx to alight on the fact that women's weaving work and both the practices and metaphors of craft more generally, of weave craft more generally, have historically and continue to be subsumed into proto-capitalist and capitalist modes of production. And yet the centering of fabric and textile as a cornerstone visual motif of Rosales' paintings, so see for instance the textile luxuriance of The Birth of Oshun, holds out the prospect of an economy of exchange in which the distribution, adornment, and access to adornment is understood as deeply rooted in cultural histories of the Black Atlantic that exceed, because they can never ever fully be captured and co-opted by, the plantation capitalisms that underwrite Sven Beckert's empires of cotton. Can we imagine a world where instead of indigenous and Black labor and suffering being transmuted into the cloth that graced Renaissance, Baroque, and Enlightenment shoulders, Black and brown bodies were securely and lusciously draped in that cloth? What reorderings of economies, what remakings of the world order would that require? I'll shortly say more about Rosales' paintings as an invitation to meditate on Black futurity. But to grasp the terms of this meditation, it seems to me appropriate at this point to consider the hermeneutic limitations of the existing world order, one that makes dreaming in Afro-diaspora so hard. Reflecting on the authors and text at the heart of her essay, Stovall has asked, quote, how can we attune to these ecolocations of desire and intimacy being expressed? Furthermore, do we have the tools, attention, and care to actually do so, end quote. In an essay that appeared 13 months ago, Sasha May Eccleston reminded disciplinary practitioners in classics and adjacent fields that, quote, there are models other than mastery available. The way we have been trained, the skills we have learned to complete projects recognizable within our disciplines may not empower us to do the work that emancipatory projects demand. We may very well have to unlearn those skills, end quote. In the search for tools with which to engage critically with Rosales, let me single out two developments one specific to the discipline that traditionally tropes itself as classics, and a second that is only minimally on the radar of most professional classicists and ancient historians, but matters mightily to the study of the religious discourses and practices of the Black Atlantic. The first, more inwardly disciplinary development that informs my reading of Rosales' work is the transformation of classical reception studies in the past 2 decades, from fledgling and, in some eyes, vestigial subfield to an important domain of research and publication. By no means is the struggle to advance reception studies as a standalone field of inquiry complete. For one, as both Luke Richardson and Patrice Rankine have explained in recent articles, reception studies remain peripheralized in the prestige economies of the discipline of classics. One reason for this is that has to do with the philological fetish that on closer examination discloses a very narrow view of philology encased in the discipline. But related to this is the question of training, or more appropriately, the blinkering nature of the training that most classicists receive and its consequences for reception studies and for the landscape of professional practice and employment in the field more generally. As Richardson notes, quote, the majority of classical reception is being taught by non-specialists. Most teaching of reception courses is undertaken by academics who did not complete a doctorate in classical reception, and whilst doctoral classical reception projects are a relatively new occurrence, most holders of such doctorates are either unemployed or have found employment by falling back on a history and ability to teach non-reception classics, such as an ability to teach Greek and Latin languages, end quote. In its current shape, the Euro-American construction of classics is structurally predisposed against granting recognition to classical reception studies as a field that requires and justifies its own internally developed criteria for professional training and employment. Most doctoral programs, my own departments included, prioritize training in Greek and Latin language as a foundation for text-focused research and teaching, and the number of art historically trained classicists who develop tools for engaging visual literacy as a cornerstone in the interpretation and elucidation of visual receptions of classicisms remains few and far between. Predictably, anything that does not fall neatly within the parameters of this training is shoved to the margins. Students are often told, either explicitly or implicitly, to pursue it as an add-on. The second, and fortunately more happily interdisciplinary development to stress, is that when it comes to the study of the religious dynamics of the Black Atlantic, we are in a boom time with an explosion of publications fueling timely and searching reassessments of religious practice across La Traversée. The seeds for this efflorescence in Anglophone scholarship were planted in the 1980s and 1990s. To name only a few of the works from those decades to have left a mark on my own research: George Simpson's Religious Cults of the Caribbean, Trinidad, Jamaica, and Haiti, which drew on fieldwork in northern Haiti, appeared in 1980. Karen McCarthy Brown came out with Mama Lola, a voodoo priestess in Brooklyn, the fruit of her collaboration with the Haitian American mambo Marie-Thérèse Alourdes Masséna Champagne Lovinsky in 1991, having teased some of that book's material in a chapter for Sandra Barnes's volume, Africa's Ogun, Old World and New. Richard Burton's Afro-Creole Power, Opposition, and Play in the Caribbean saw the light of publication in 1997. An intensive work to recover the histories of ritual and worship among past and contemporary Afro-diaspora communities has proceeded ever since. On Santeria, I've profited from my Princeton colleague Aisha Belisto de Jesus' Electric Santeria, Racial and Sexual Assemblages of Transnational Religion. Roberto Strongman has brought Caribbean religious traditions into closer dialogue with queer theory and queering Black Atlantic religions, transcorporeality, and candomblé, Santeria, and voodoo. And Elizabeth Perez, whom I'm very happy to hear will be lecturing as part of this series, Religion in the Kitchen, Cooking, Talking, and the Making of Black Atlantic Traditions, is exciting for its ethnography of Lukumi and much else besides. Noteworthy here, too, are works that scrutinize the interplay between the historical arc of Black Atlantic religions and modern colonialist imperialist designs. So, for example, Gloria Garcia Peña's The Borders of Dominicanidad contains a sparkling chapter on the criminalization of Dominican Blackness during the US occupation of the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924 that trains its sights on, among other things, spiritual cofradías. But lately I found most bracing, and in terms of my own work, most challenging, the insistence of Alexis Wells Ogogome in The Souls of Womenfolk, the religious cultures of enslaved women in the Lower South, that we take apart the composite category of slave religion and re-articulate it around the axis of gender. Enslaved women's religious history, she writes, introduces experiences, orientations, and bodies that demand the construction of new methodological approaches to the study of religion and slavery. Although captive females' experiences of capture, transport, and sale paralleled in many ways the experiences of their male counterparts, their dismemberment engendered a triple consciousness. It was this triple consciousness, this awareness of their mutually constitutive subject positions as women, slaves, and caretakers, that lent a distinctive hue to their remembrances. The conditions under which women witnessed their children die, experienced childbirth, participated in sex, maintained relationships, and reared their dependents shifted drastically as their bodies and wombs became the primary currency in a global trade. Their rejoinders to these meanings became the basis for their religious cultures aimed at countering the dismemberment wrought by their enslavers, securing a better quality of life, and ensuring the enslaved community's survival, end quote. The challenge that Wells Ogogome's Souls and similarly Jessica Marie Johnson's Wicked Flesh pose to my historical sensibility about the interactions of religious expression and mass enslavement boils down to this. On the one hand, the Middle Passage was culturally annihilative, and its ravages culminated in forms of epistemicide whose silencing effects surround us, all of us, on every side. On the other hand, the many millions trafficked on the boats brought cultural and religious practices, world-making practices with them that did survive. Rosales posed the crucial question in her artist talk recently. How did it survive? In the face of historical and contemporary forms of suppression and erasure, how do the West African gods of the Middle Passage survive? Rosales' paintings and their refraction of Black Atlantic religiosity can quite enhancingly be read through Wells Ogogome's triple consciousness, an amplification of the double consciousness model that's espoused in the work whose enduring influence Alexis Wells Ogogome registers in the title of her own book. This is Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. Rosales has provided a primer for reading the Orishas within a triple framework, as those of you who listened to her talk the other day will know. And while I'll defer consideration of syncretism to the Q&A, it's important to be alert to the clarifying force of this exercise as modeled here. It's an attempt to line up incommensurables. In step with Rosales, I wonder if by working through one of her paintings, we might be able to see the work of triple consciousness in action. With Migration of the Gods, an exceptionally pointed meditation on the interface of human and non-human migration in the Middle Passage, there seem to me to be several layers of consciousness detectable. There are, first of all, the consciousnesses of animate human and non-human, as well as superhuman entities. There is the water as an animate and, in fact, conscious entity that exerts and can continue to exert a will of its own. And finally, there is a historical consciousness of the durées involved in the migration of human beings in the company of their gods. This travel is a travel in company and in community, a travel in the wake. What is spatialized in the painting itself has a temporal vector, as my remark just now will have made clear. And here we move to what I see as the most singularly captivating feature of the painting. It's an exemplification of classicism, not just classicism in the sense of value, but classicism as a technology for manipulating time. Because even as it comments on the pasts of the Middle Passage, the painting kinetically propels the past of that passage into a future, and that future has a name. It is a future that vibrates in a painting that I return to quite often. Andres Sanchez Calque's 1599 painting, Los Mulatos de Esmeraldas. This painting is the subject of a recent essay by Baltasar Framolinero that began by taking issue with aspects of the painting's curation at the Museo de America in Madrid, before advancing an Afrofuturist appraisal of the painting, whose original inspiration he credits in part to a viewing of the movie Black Panther. Here is a quotation from his essay, which is in Spanish. I'll read a translation of the first few sentences. It involves placing oneself in the eyes of the free mulatto gentleman and the indigenous artist himself, who proposes an official framing portrait in which those portrayed are represented with authority. This authority is a formulation of a possible future. Some descendants of Blacks and Indians are seen sharing power, or at the very least a portion of that power. Because to be the subject of portraiture and named with an honorific title in the frame of the canvas itself is synonymous with holding authority. These three figures, these three authorized figures sent from the Indies to the King of Spain, represent a moment of crisis in the structure of Spanish power, a future that questions the racial hegemony derived from the Iberian Peninsula. The Mulattos of Esmeraldas constitutes a pictorial construction, a fiction that shares its objectives with speculative Afrofuturist fictions of the present, the novels of Octavia Butler, Samuel Delany, which are epistemological projects in which it is predicated from a Afro-diasporic historical perspective that Blacks will exist in the future, and not simply as heralds of chaos, but that Blacks are the future. This is a communication from Rosales' work too, and it is one to which I will hold on for dear life. Her works are about the future of Blackness, and it is in that future that I propose we all set up and take residence. Thank you very much. I will now stop sharing, and I hope we can have some conversation.
Thank you so much, Dan-el, for that extremely rich and thought-provoking talk. We will take questions in the chat, so please do ask questions in the chat. While you're doing that, maybe I could start with a question. I have worried, and I've wondered and worried about to what extent Harmonia Rosales' choice to use Greek myth or to use Renaissance classicism as a means to smuggle in or seduce people into viewing the tales of the pataquis of the Lucimi, and my choice to focus on that as part of the exhibition in the curation. I wondered whether that, to what extent that is an echo of the original or the practices of the Lucimi, the enslaved people who had taken to Cuba, worship through the Catholic saints. I'm not saying it's the same thing at all. We're in very different positions, but I've wondered to what extent the one is a distant echo, if you like, of the other. And I wondered if you had any, if you think I'm right to worry about that, or if you had any thoughts.
Oh, but I mean, I guess one question that I would have by way of volley is, how much does it worry you? And I mean, what are the properties of this worrying? I mean, to be fair, I mean, I ask this because I also reflect often on what it means to engage in this kind of juxtaposition, right? So when I ask you, you know, what are sort of the contours or parameters of that concern, I'm interested in knowing more about what, if anything, there is to be gained from performing the sort of critical exegesis of our disquiet in the face of that. So I'm going to push it back your way, and then I'll jump in with some more thoughts.
When you say what's the value of that, are you saying be quiet and stop worrying publicly, or are you?
No. I think the airing the public worry is important, but I wonder how consequential.
I suppose. I suppose that I'm all too aware of institutional pressures and structures that replicate power imbalances, which is to say that the only way that we could stage this exhibition is with money to promote Greek culture. We haven't got a fund to promote African culture, or at least I'm not in charge of that fund. I'm not aware of that fund. And I did sometimes wonder how much that then influenced that remit, influenced the curation. I'm also concerned about what you were talking about in your talk as being when you mentioned identity capitalists and Nancy Leong. You know, I'm aware that one of the things that this exhibition will have done is to introduce several thousand, actually, Greek mythology students to the Art of Harmonia Rosales and to the Yoruba religion and myths. And that is a good thing, but I'm also concerned about how I frame that when we teach it. I was talking to my TAs and I were talking about this. So it's just something that's that I've been thinking about and that you made me think more about.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful to you for working me through the various components of the worry. So the first answer that I am tempted to give, you know, and I would be tempted to give this in sort of similar situations, is that there is a very, very concrete and pragmatic rationale for doing what you have been doing in a practice of redistribution, which is in a way one of the aspects of the exhibition that stands out to me the most. If we understand that historically a certain configuration of classicism has managed to accumulate a great deal of capital and has maintained its hold on that capital, even in the face of some pretty formidable challenges to its standing in the contemporary moment, then what do we see as the responsibilities incumbent on custodians or stakeholders who would want ideally to move classics and classicism in a new direction? Well, that responsibility would have to be, at least in part, a redistributive one. But I think then the question that comes to the fore, especially for those of us who are in pedagogical or pedagogically facing contexts, as we and many of the listeners on the Zoom will be, is how to do this framing with due rigor. And here is where one of the sort of abiding concerns with the sort of current iteration of classical reception studies that I raised in the talk surfaces again. My training in Caribbean studies was, and in some ways, an accidental and almost supplemental feature of my professionalization. And there are many, many messages I received, some rather blunt, about the need to prioritize other aspects of my training. And so, faced with those messages, one can engage in a kind of undercommons practice in which the university, in which doctoral programs, in which undergraduate teaching, in which pretty much any aspect of the institutional structure becomes a site for the practice of a certain mode of fugitivity. And I'm cool with that, right? So, in the very best channeling of Fred Moten and co. We just take what we can grab and we redirect it to our favorite and preferred ends, all with an eye to emancipation, and we just keep it humming. But surely, and this now gets, I think, to something that I would wish to hear about from other folks in the audience, surely there is a future beyond this future. And if we are building towards something, the question for me is that something simply a scaled up form of this fugitivity in which we are all much more honest about this rating, or is a third university possible, in the words of Paperson? That to me would be the area of inquiry to zero in on next.
Thank you. And we have a question from Olga. Thank you for this exciting talk. Can you say a bit more about the art form of painting as a medium to collapse the distance between classics and Afro-diasporic and Yoruba mythologies? Thinking, for example, about the ways that the Black female body has been historically objectified through visual art. What are ways in which you think Harmonia uses this visual medium to overturn this objectifying trend, especially in her Black nudes? Thank you.
That's a great question from Olga. Olga, it's great to reconnect, if only through the prism of Zoom. I think that your question answers itself, because your question contains within it the seeds of the answer that I'll give. So I'll sketch sort of two paths by which we can sort of better appreciate Rosales' intervention. One is a version of the line I trotted out in talk. Like I think that there's something very powerful, not just about the exposition of the Black female body, but also its draping and clothing in her works. And so I would want to emphasize that more, that one of the things that we see in Rosales' work is an attention to a sort of comprehensive habitus and hexus of Blackness that it invites both sort of productive juxtaposition with Renaissance and later iterations of objectifying nudes, and also at the same time introduces elements of Yoruba world making, especially in the color schemes of the paintings that seem to be particularly well suited to the work of turning the Black female body from object to subject. But another aspect of this that I would like to think more about concerns what Rosales in a number of interviews has stressed as the sort of empowerment of the Black female body in these paintings. And here I am of two minds. So on the one hand, there are formal registers that can be scrutinized for what they seem to suggest about empowerment. Like I mean, the first that comes to mind is, of course, the centering of Black women as agential in these paintings. They're not peripheralized. They're at the beating heart, several of them. And in that centering, I think we see, again, an emphasis not on the objectification of the Black female body, but on its subjectification. At the same time, though, and here is where I find myself at a bit of a conceptual impasse, I am not necessarily sure that the work of situating the Black female body within an iconographic and visual repertoire that recasts, as it does, some of the Renaissance paintings that are intertextual works and intervisuals to Rosales' works fully displaces that tradition of Black female objectification. And I don't think we should hope for a full displacement of that objectification, right? The idea is that you do honor both to the past, present, and future of Black female subjecthood and to the histories of objectification that are patterned and continue to pattern the expressions of that subjecthood. So in all that, I think, Olga, what is to be taken away is that there are visual devices that Rosales plays with very expertly to make it clear that the Black female body is endowed with subjective force in these paintings, but that at the same time, the paintings manage to evoke a history of painting and portraiture that insistently denies Black female bodies an opportunity to exercise subjecthood. And that to me is one of the more energizing clashes detectable in Rosales' work.
May I just add to that within the exhibit itself, the video of the interview between Lexi Trikulis and Harmonia Rosales, in that video, there's an interesting part where she talks about her choice to portray all of the women with very close cropped hair, and that's partly because of her experiences with having so much judgment about hair and so much prejudice about different ways of doing hair and so on. So I invite you all to see that when you see the exhibition as well. So a couple more questions. One panelist, questioner asks, are religious ideas, myths, and practices from the Middle Passage important to your own background? And if so, how does it impact the work that you do?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer would begin with an exposition of the force of the Santos in my own life, and the many fractures, especially in my adolescence and young adulthood, between different religious formations in my immediate family circle and beyond. The fractures are reducible in brief to a tension between what I understood to be the sort of Orthodox and true Roman Catholicism on the other hand, which was held up to me by some members of my family, and the Catholic context that I inhabited as a teenager as not just authoritative, but as more deserving and more deserving of my time and more trustworthy than the Afro-Caribbean practices that were central to the spiritual identification and world makings of other members of my family. And this tension kept playing out. It was also very racialized. And this was something that took me a while to fully grasp when I was a teenager. But the one thing I'll stress as part of a provisional answer to that question is that only with the passage of time did it dawn on me that the many interactions I had had with practitioners of Afro diasporic religion in the diaspora, in the Dominican American diaspora, but really in the Caribbean diaspora more generally, had prepared me to think in a much more sort of eclectically ecumenical way about histories of religious practice and expressions of religious agency across space and time, especially as these were inflected by the legacies of the Middle Passage. So it was only with progression through my training as a historian of religion and as a historian of slavery that it became abundantly clear to me that the experiences of my childhood and adolescence in the diaspora were actually incredibly generative for a kind of immanent theory that I could then bring to bear on my study of pre-modern forms of religious expression in context of mass enslavement.
Thank you. A question from Kendall Lively, and I'm going to adapt it slightly. Does the work of other Black and Latinx artists have relevance in reading the work of Harmonia Rosales? And does the work of, are there similar non-Black Indigenous artists like Kent Monkman who might also have relevance for reading the art of Harmonia Rosales?
So I think that there is clear relevance and the potential for much generativity. I want to sort of think about one issue that has come up in research I'm doing in a somewhat different context, but nonetheless a context that sort of continues to shape how I enter into and negotiate this terrain. So some time ago, I became interested in how African American writers from the early 20th century on imagine and enter into productive discourses with Indigenous writers. And I became particularly interested in the presence or absence of Indigenous writers, Indigenous frameworks, and Indigenous cosmographies in W.B. Du Bois. And something that had stood out to me as I went down this path was the possibility that there had been some sort of intrinsic features of Du Bois's own orientations in classicism, and in a particular kind of classicism, that had precluded his ability to grasp alternative classicisms, including ones that were being developed, had been developed among Native American communities. I struggled with this for a while, but then thanks to the invitation of Matthias Hanslis, who I think is in the audience, and Jackie Murray, I gave a paper on this. And drafting the paper made me commit to a position, the distant relative of which was voiced briefly in tonight's talk. The position is that it is possible in some cases that habituation in and grounding in one form or a sort of discretely bounded form of classicism may limit the ability of some writers and artists to appreciate other forms of classicism. I have stripped away from the preceding sentences any references to Greco-Roman classicism, right? So I think that it is clear that for those folks who have been working within traditions that consistently privilege not just Greco-Roman classicisms, but like a specifically white-centric version of Greco-Roman classicism, the capacity to grasp classicisms operating independently of and external to that white encoded classicism is limited or attenuated at best. But I'm thinking more broadly than that. I am interested in the question of classicism as a technology. And if the technology is separable from the specific instantiation that is Greco-Roman classicism, I would want to know whether it is conceivable to theorize, it is even actionable to engage in theory about different kinds of classicism, including classicisms that would extend well outside of the Black Atlantic, well beyond the circuits traced in this talk and in the volume that I referenced that came out in 2020. And that question is very alive for me. I think the folks that are best suited to contribute to those conversations are folks with training in classicisms from other parts of the world. And so to that end, I think one of the more important sort of issues of infrastructure to address ourselves to in the next few years is how to build up meaningful collaborations with folks in other parts of the world for whom the question of rethinking and reimagining the capabilities of their own contingent classicisms has taken on and continues to hold a particularly charged resonance. So that would be, I think, central to me. I want to think more about Kent Monkman, with whose work I'm very intrigued. So I'll defer answering on that.
Oh, thank you. And I'd like to ask one final question then, and that is, just could you say a bit more about Harmonia Rosales as the future? Not to rehash what you said about temporality, but I'd just like you to expand a little bit more on Harmonia Rosales as the future, if that's possible.
I'm happy to expand on that. So when I think about the effort at visualizing the Yoruba mythologies and their travel across space and time, the first move I make is one that I had telegraphed in the paper as a move more or less in accordance with my own professional training, to understand this as primarily something in need of historicizing on account of its pastness. But, and this was why I was motivated to lead off with the passage from Piedad Alegría Judas's memoir, the other dimension to this that appeals to me immensely, and that I think will come even more vibrantly to the fore in the lecture that Elizabeth Perez will give, is an understanding of these mythologies that is alert to their organic currency for many communities, Afro-Cuban and other Afro-Caribbean communities in the here and now. So that is a claim about the present, and I think that claim is not really one that needs much in the way of substantiation, in that these practices are alive and with us. They are here right now. The big question is about the future. And here is where I have drawn some real energy from Rosales's work. So one aspect of this future that holds appeal to me, and this goes back now to Olga's question, is the prospect of centering the historically marginalized and objectified as creators and agents of their time and of future times in their own right. A version of this would sort of invest in axes of the construction of the future that insist on transmission, perhaps even reproduction, although I'm wary of this for reasons that we might want to take up, if only because, as has been made very clear to me by the work of Marcella Ward and others, there is much to be gained in embracing a form of kinship for the present and future that does not hew strictly to, and in fact might actually seek to ardently disavow biological modes of reproduction. But setting that to the side for now, what I want to stress in Rosales's work, and I'm thinking in particular of those works that focus on mobility and migration. So I talked about migration of the gods, but here we might also note Still We Rise. I want to think of how in their play with time and in their willingness to conflate multiple registers of time, the paintings point us to a yet unrealized future, but one that it is to be hoped will feature some of these scenes of riotous insurgents and strife. The aspect of Still We Rise that grips me the most is, of course, the incineration of a certain flag. And I find that exhilarating because even as we move towards a dystopia of civil discord in our own time, it may very well be the case that if the promise of this and other paintings is realized, the future that comes into being is one that is defined by and overseen by the care work and coalition work and collaborative work of Black folks. But whether we will all be in the heavens before that happens or not is something that we will have to wait and find out.
And on that, are you happy to take another question? Or? Yeah,
sure.
Okay, I had said that was the last question, but Matthias Hanses says, thank you, Dan-el, for this great talk. Given the priorities you have just outlined, I hesitate to ask a question that relates to Greece and Rome, but I was wondering if you see in Harmonia Rosales' works not only a statement about a Black future, but also one about a Black past. What I mean by that is that many of the Renaissance paintings that provide visual intertext for Rosales connect back to Greco-Roman antiquity when the social construct of whiteness did not yet exist. Is Rosales in a way replacing the Renaissance's whitened view of the past with something that we could consider, in a sense, more historically accurate? It's an interesting question.
Thank you, Matthias, for that question. I am torn about this. So the other day, I was circling back through the teaching of a course on race and the inhumanities, as my co-instructor and I titled it, that was offered this past spring. And as I had been sort of preparing the materials for that course, I was reminded of something that Hannah Kulik-Baird and others raised on a Twitter thread today, which is that despite the incredible heavy lifting that Frank Snowden did to compile all of these images of Black people from antiquity, the visual mediation of antiquity persistently centers white seeming or white legible bodies. And so much of the work that Snowden and others have done and continue to do. I'm thinking most recently of Sarah Derbeau to foreground and accentuate not just the presence, but the visual reproduction of Blackness in antiquity remains to the margins. And so there would be real purchase in the recovery and reproduction of an antiquity in the contemporary moment that was actually faithful to that, right? And so in this respect, I am inclined to answer Matthias's question with a yes. However, there are two hedges. The first is that for reasons that are sort of running underneath the surface of the talk, but that probably came into focus by the final third, I do not really think we can escape the position of the present in interpreting the racial configurations of the past and of the Greco-Roman past. And so the recovery of a more historically accurate version of Greco-Roman antiquity is necessarily one that is undertaken by racialized practitioners in the present, and therefore is one that is haunted by all of these ghosts of intermediating perceptions and constructions of race, including the Renaissance one. So I think that there is no easy way out. The other hedge is, well, it has to do with a premise that is baked into Matthias's question. So Matthias has raised the point that the social construct of whiteness did not yet exist in antiquity. And this is something that Dee and others have in many publications sought to underscore. While I'm willing to accept this to a degree, I am beginning to incline to the position that a certain distributed construct of Blackness in antiquity did exist, and that if one is thinking about racial paradigms and racial assignments in antiquity, it is important to attend to the commercial visual representation and reproduction of Blackness as one feature of this. Now, how to sort of understand this Blackness in relation to other configurations, somatic and non-somatic, of race is, of course, the tricky thing that many scholars in this contemporary moment, I'm thinking of Rebecca Futo-Kennedy, of Jackie Murray, Sarah Derbu, and others, are hard at work to isolate. But let me give a very specific example of this. So from the baths of Timgad in Algeria, we have this mosaic. It's reproduced in two of Snowden's volumes. And Snowden, in one of his volumes, also has an entry outlining similar mosaics. It's a mosaic that depicts a Black boy who has racializing markers of Blackness, holding an extravagantly sized penis while he's in the baths. Now, there are a couple of different ways of reading this. And what is, I think, unassailable is the idea that, this is obviously part of the sort of visual logics of humor that we might expect in Roman baths, and that, this particular sort of ithophallic boy is just one sort of iteration of a Mediterranean-wide visual discourse that had been active for many, many centuries by the time this mosaic was commissioned. But I am intrigued by the reproducibility and the mass marketing of the Black body in antiquity as potentially a signal of the organization of racial category of Blackness that depends vitally on its circulation through visual modes in order to attain salience in the broader Roman population, both provincially and, of course, in the Italian peninsula itself. And it is in this conjuncture of racialized visual characterization and visual reproduction at scale and at number, that we might begin to see something akin to the kinds of social constructs of Blackness that we see in other periods that are also intimately embedded in this sort of two-part formation of visual representation times the capacity to multiply and circulate across regions, across very large spaces. This is why I hesitate to embrace fully the direction in which Matthias's question leads us. Because on the one hand, it would be, I think, tempting to accept, in light of some of the recent work that's been done on race and antiquity, the notion that given the absence of a social construct of whiteness, Rosales' intervention could be understood as a recuperative operation of how people in antiquity really were. A lot of Black and brown people around. That's how it is. But what I see as important about Rosales' work is that it is attentive to the reproduction of alternative schemes for visualizing Blackness and brownness, but crucially, that responds in its own way to a different feature of ancient and specifically sort of Greco-Roman Mediterranean conceptualizations of race. And that is the need to circulate race as a visual artifact and commodity indexed to particular objects, some of high value and some of more pedestrian use, like vases, for example. So that's where I would attempt to qualify some aspects of Matthias's question.
Thank you so much, Dan-el, it's for this absolutely fascinating talk and conversation. And thanks to you all, both who asked questions and everybody in the audience. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.